Willi crouched behind a cluster of thick-trunked trees, with bark that shimmered iridescent blue in the harsh light. His standard-issue thermal jacket doing little against the biting wind that swept down from the mountain range. He had been tracking the indigenous wildlife patterns for 3 weeks now, documenting their migrations for the research station's database, following protocols that forbade any interference with the native population. The planet designated as Kepler 4422c had proven more complex than initial scans suggested. Its ecosystem a web of predator and prey relationships that defied easy categorization. Blue-furred creatures the size of wolves hunted in coordinated packs, while smaller herbivores with 6 legs bounded across the plains in herds that stretched for kilometers. He adjusted his binoculars, focusing on a depression in the valley below, where water pooled from an underground spring. The liquid here wasn't quite water, containing trace minerals that gave it a faint luminescent quality, but the local fauna depended on it just as Earth creatures depended on H2O. Movement caught his attention, but not the animal kind he expected. 4 figures emerged from the opposite tree line, moving with practiced stealth. They wore dark leather armor studded with what looked like bone fragments, their faces hidden behind masks carved from some kind of blackened wood. Each carried weapons that spoke of violence and efficiency. Curved blades, short spears with barbed tips, and most concerning, compact crossbows already loaded and ready. Between them, they herded a small figure in silver robes that caught the crimson light like liquid metal. Willi's breath caught in his throat as he zoomed in on the child. No more than 7 years old by his estimation, with skin the color of a clear summer sky and eyes wide with terror. Her small hands clutched at the robes as if they might protect her, and when she stumbled over a root, one of the masked warriors yanked her upright with a brutality that made Willi's jaw clench. The child was clearly of the same species as the blue-skinned inhabitants he had observed from afar during his surveys. The ones who had built the magnificent stone cities visible from orbit, whose civilization predated human spaceflight by millennia, according to the xenoarchaeologists. Protocol was clear: non-interference, observer status only. These were the rules drilled into every researcher who set foot on a planet with indigenous intelligent life. Willi had signed the documents, attended the mandatory briefings, understood the reasoning behind the Prime Directive-style regulations. Humanity's history of contact with less technologically advanced societies on Earth itself was stained with colonialism, genocide, and cultural destruction. The Kepler Survey Corps existed to study, not to intervene. He should retreat, document what he saw, report it to the station commander, and let the proper channels handle it. But then the child turned her face toward his hiding spot, not seeing him, but looking in his direction, and something in the angle of her features, the shape of her terror, overlaid itself perfectly with a memory that never fully left him. Emily, his daughter Emily, who had died 3 years ago in a transport accident, whose 7th birthday party he had missed because of a mandatory training rotation, whose last words to him over the comm had been asking when Daddy would come home. The girl's frightened eyes mirrored Emily's in that horrible moment when she must have realized the transport was going down, and rational thought fled Willi's mind like smoke before a gale. His body moved before his brain could override the decision. He exploded from cover, his boots pounding against the uneven ground as he charged down the slope toward the valley floor. The warriors reacted with trained precision, one of them shouting an alarm in a language that sounded like wind through stone corridors. 2 of them raised their crossbows, the mechanical click of release mechanisms audible even over his ragged breathing. The child screamed, a high sound of pure terror, and Willi saw the trajectory, saw where the bolts would strike her small body. He dove, arms outstretched, his momentum carrying him into a collision course with the girl. His shoulder hit her center mass and knocked her sideways, his body folding over hers protectively as they tumbled to the ground together. The impact drove the air from his lungs, but worse was the sensation that followed immediately after. Pain, searing, unimaginable pain that started between his shoulder blades and spread through his nervous system like wildfire. He had felt pain before: broken bones, burns, the usual catalog of injuries that came with fieldwork on hostile planets. But this was different. This was cold fire, liquid nitrogen injected directly into his veins, every cell in his body screaming in unison. Willi's vision grayed at the edges. Through the gathering darkness, he saw the crossbow bolt protruding from his back, its tip coated with a substance that gleamed toxic green in the red sunlight. The poison was already doing its work, shutting down his motor functions, making his fingers spasm and then go numb. He couldn't move his legs. He couldn't feel anything below his waist. The girl was screaming beneath him, struggling to get out from under his weight, and he wanted to tell her she was safe, that it would be okay, but his tongue had gone thick and unresponsive in his mouth. Sounds of combat erupted around them. New voices, authoritative and commanding, cut through the chaos. The clash of metal on metal, grunts of effort, the wet sound of blades finding flesh. Willi's paralyzed form was rolled off the child, and through swimming vision, he saw a female warrior in gleaming silver armor kneeling beside the girl, checking her for injuries with hands that shook with barely contained fury. The warrior's face was a study in controlled rage, her blue skin darker than the child's, her features sharp and angular, where the girl's were round with youth. She wore her black hair in a complex braid wound with silver wire, and across her breastplate was etched a symbol that even in his dying state Willi recognized as significant, a crown with 7 points. This was Zoella, captain of the Royal Guard. He had seen her from a distance during his observations of the capital city, leading patrols along the outer walls, training soldiers in the practice yards. She was a legend among her people, a warrior who had fought in the territorial wars that had unified 3 continents under one banner, whose name was spoken with equal parts respect and fear. And right now she was looking at him with an expression that contained no gratitude, only cold assessment and something that might have been contempt. She barked orders in her native tongue, and 2 of her guardsmen moved to secure the area, while a third checked the bodies of the attackers. All 4 were dead, their blood the same blue as their skin, but darker, almost purple, where it pooled on the ground. Zoella lifted the child, Princess Sofiani, he would learn later, and cradled her against her armored chest. The girl's small hands reached back toward Willi, her voice high and insistent. But Zoella turned away, issuing more commands. She clearly wanted to leave him there, to let the poison finish its work and erase the evidence of his interference. But the child wouldn't stop reaching for him, wouldn't stop crying out, and Zoella's face twisted with some internal struggle before she finally gestured sharply to her men. They lifted Willi with surprising gentleness, though every movement sent fresh waves of agony through his freezing body. The world tilted and spun, the red sky wheeling overhead as they carried him. He tried to speak, to explain, to apologize for breaking protocol, but his mouth produced only a wet, gurgling sound. The paralysis was spreading to his respiratory system. He was drowning in air, suffocating while his lungs still functioned. The journey became a blur of crimson light and shadow, of voices speaking urgently around him, of the sensation of being carried through passages that smelled of stone and incense, and the particular mustiness of ancient places. He caught glimpses of vaulted ceilings carved with intricate reliefs, of pillars that seemed to support more than just physical weight, of alcoves where stone sarcophagi rested in eternal silence. The Hall of Ancestors, though he didn't know the name yet, was where they brought those whose actions earned them a place among the remembered dead. They laid him on a cold stone platform, and through the narrowing tunnel of his vision, Willi saw Zoella arguing with a group of elderly figures in robes marked with symbols of authority and learning. One of them, a male with skin so pale it was almost white, his age evident in every line of his face, approached and examined Willi with detached clinical interest. He pressed fingers to Willi's neck, checking for pulse, then peeled back an eyelid to look at the dilated pupil beneath. He spoke at length, his voice a dry whisper that seemed to fill the entire hall, and though Willi couldn't understand the words, he caught the tone of surprise, of fascination. Zoella's response was sharp, dismissive, her hand never straying far from the sword at her hip. She clearly wanted Willi dead, wanted this complication erased. But the elderly healer shook his head, pointing at Willi's still form, and said something that made all the other robed figures lean in with interest. The child Sofiani had been taken away by other attendants, but her absence only seemed to fuel Zoella's anger. She paced like a caged predator, her boots ringing against stone, every line of her body speaking of barely restrained violence. The decision, when it came, was not to Zoella's liking. The healers conferred among themselves, occasionally gesturing to Willi, to ancient texts retrieved from somewhere in the hall's depths, to instruments that gleamed with polished metal and looked like they belonged in a medieval surgical theater. One of them produced a long needle and drew a sample of Willi's blood, which had taken on a faintly greenish tinge where the poison mixed with human hemoglobin. They tested it, mixing it with various substances, observing reactions that meant nothing to Willi's fading consciousness. Finally, the eldest healer spoke what sounded like a pronouncement. Zoella froze, her face going through a rapid sequence of emotions: disbelief, anger, resignation, and finally cold acceptance. She turned to look at Willi one last time before she strode from the hall, her footsteps echoing long after she disappeared from view. The healers began their work, and Willi felt himself being moved again, lifted and placed into something that felt like liquid glass. A transparent substance filled his field of vision, thick and viscous, with a bluish tint that reminded him of tropical ocean water. The bioglass coffin was an engineering marvel by any standard, ancient technology that the civilization had perfected over generations. It was designed to preserve the dead, to keep their forms from decay so that future generations could look upon the faces of those who had shaped their history. But in Willi's case, it was being repurposed in a way that had never been intended. The poison in his system had interacted with his human biochemistry in an unexpected way. Instead of killing him outright, it had triggered a kind of metabolic stasis, freezing his biological processes at the cellular level. His heart beat once every several minutes. His brain consumed oxygen at a rate that barely registered on the healer's instruments. He was not dead, but he was so far from alive that the difference became philosophical. The healers explained this to Zoella when she returned hours later, her armor removed, dressed now in the simpler clothing of off-duty service. They showed her the readings, the evidence of Willi's impossible state. By their law, by the ancient codes that govern their civilization, a life given in defense of royal blood could not be discarded, no matter how inconvenient. But neither could they wake him. The poison would kill him if his metabolism returned to normal, and they had no antidote for a substance that had been designed to kill their own kind, let alone an alien physiology they had never encountered before. So Willi became a monument, a living corpse trapped in perfect awareness inside a prison of his own frozen body. They placed his coffin in an alcove of the Hall of Ancestors, not among the true dead, but in a side chamber where the light from high windows painted geometric patterns across the floor in the morning hours. And there he remained, conscious but immobile, his mind the only part of him still fully functional, trapped in an endless moment that stretched forward into an unknown future. The first days were the worst. Willi's mind, still operating at near normal speed despite his body's stasis, experienced every second of every minute with crystal clarity. He tried to move, sent desperate signals to muscles that could no longer respond, screamed silently behind lips that would not open. Panic gave way to despair to resignation, and finally to a kind of meditative acceptance. He counted heartbeats, each one separated by what felt like hours. He memorized every crack in the stone ceiling above his alcove, every variation in the blue liquid that surrounded him, every mote of dust that drifted in the light. His only visitor in those first days was Sofiani. The child came every morning, accompanied by attendants who kept a respectful distance but never let her out of sight. She would press her small hands against the bioglass, her blue face solemn in a way that no 7-year-old should be. She brought drawings, crude stick figures in bright pigments on rough paper, showing a large figure shielding a small one from danger. She talked to him in her language, which he slowly began to understand through context and repetition. She called him the sleeping guardian, her protector who had fallen into enchanted slumber like a hero from the old stories. Zoella came much later, weeks after the incident. She approached his alcove as if approaching an enemy position, her movements controlled and wary. For a long time she simply stood there, studying him with an expression he couldn't read. Then she spoke, her voice low and tight with barely contained emotion. She told him, in the universal trade language that was used for diplomatic communications, in which he understood, that she hated him. hated him for being braver than she had been in that crucial moment, hated him for making her hesitate, for exposing a weakness she had spent her entire life training away. She confessed things to the glass, things she would never say to another living soul. She had seen the attackers approaching, had recognized the sigil on their armor as belonging to a rebel faction led by a warlord named Prosper. She should have intercepted them sooner, should have cut them down before they got within 100 paces of the princess. But she had hesitated just for a heartbeat, calculating angles of attack and defensive positions, and in that heartbeat, the crossbows had been raised. She, the legendary captain of the guard, had frozen, and a human stranger had to do what she should have done without thought. Willi wanted to tell her that he understood, that there was no shame in being human, in having that instant of calculation that separated trained soldiers from berserkers. But he could only listen, trapped behind the transparent barrier, as she poured out her self-recrimination. She came back the next day and the day after that, each time finding new reasons to berate herself, to catalog her failures. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, the tenor of her visits began to change. Months passed. Willi learned to mark time by the subtle changes in the light, by the growth he could observe in Sofiani during her visits, by the gradual deepening of the lines around Zoella's eyes. The warrior captain brought him an audio recording one day, extracted from the wreckage of his shuttle that had been retrieved from the crash site where he had abandoned it in his haste to track the wildlife. On it was the voice of his daughter Emily, singing a nonsense song about stars and spaceships, recorded 2 weeks before the accident that had taken her. Zoella had listened to it, had heard the love in that child's voice, had understood finally why Willi had thrown away his life for a strange alien child he had never met. Her anger transformed into something else. Respect, first, grudging acknowledgement that his sacrifice had come from a place of pain and loss rather than some sense of moral superiority, then curiosity about this human who had chosen to die rather than watch a child suffer. She brought him things from his shuttle, a photo cube showing Emily at various ages, a worn paperback book of poetry that had been his wife's before she left him, a small carved wooden horse that Emily had made in school. She arranged them on a shelf visible from his coffin, creating a shrine of sorts to his lost life. Years accumulated like sediment. Willi watched Sofiani grow from a frightened 7-year-old into a confident teenager who carried herself with the bearing of someone who knew she would one day rule. She still visited, though less frequently now, her duties as crown princess demanding more of her time. She told him about her studies, about learning the histories of their people, about the complexities of statecraft and diplomacy. She spoke of Prosper, the warlord who had ordered her assassination, who controlled large swaths of the southern territories, and who grew bolder with each passing season. Zoella's visits became the fixed point around which Willi's existence revolved. She came every evening without fail, as regular as the atomic clock that had once regulated the life support systems on his shuttle. She told him about the war, about skirmishes along the border, about soldiers under her command who died in battles she described with tactical precision and emotional exhaustion. She spoke of her loneliness, of the isolation that came with command, of the impossibility of forming connections when everyone either feared her or wanted something from her. She confessed that she had never married, never allowed herself the weakness of attachment. Her life had been dedicated to the royal family, to the defense of the realm, to the perfection of her combat skills. She was 43 years old, had killed her first enemy at 16, had earned her captaincy at 25 through a trial by combat that left her with scars across her ribs that still ached in cold weather. She had lovers, occasional encounters that satisfied physical needs, but never touched the deeper parts of her. And through all of it, she had been alone in the ways that mattered. But here, in this hall of the dead, speaking to a man who could not respond, she found a strange peace. Willi became her confessor, her sounding board, the one person in her life who knew her completely and could offer no judgment, no advice, no attempts to change her. She brought wine sometimes, pouring herself a glass and sitting on the stone floor with her back against the wall, talking into the growing darkness as the sun set beyond the high windows. She told him jokes, shared gossip from the court, complained about incompetent junior officers, and the political machinations that constantly threatened to undermine military readiness. A decade passed, then two. Willi felt time only through the changes in those around him. Sofiani reached her majority, was crowned queen in a ceremony Zoella described in loving detail, complete with the mistakes made by nervous attendants and the unexpected humor when one of the ancient crowns proved too large and had to be hastily adjusted. Zoella herself began to show age, silver threading through her black hair, the lines around her eyes deepening into permanent fixtures. But her body remained hard and strong, kept fit by constant training and regular combat, and her visits never wavered. The war with Prosper escalated. He had somehow acquired firearms, crude, muzzle-loaded affairs that nonetheless represented a terrifying advantage over swords and spears. Zoella described the devastation, the way a single volley could break a shield wall that would have held against any conventional charge. The capital city was fortified, its walls reinforced with additional stone and timber, preparations made for a siege that everyone knew was coming. Sofiani proved herself a capable leader, rallying the nobles and coordinating the defense, but Zoella privately worried that it wouldn't be enough. On the day the walls finally shook from bombardment, Willi had been in his glass prison for 30 years. 30 years of perfect consciousness. 30 years of watching the world age while he remained frozen in the moment of his sacrifice. Zoella came to him that morning, her armor freshly cleaned, her weapons sharpened. She told him that this might be their last conversation, that Prosper had breached the outer fortifications and was pushing toward the palace. She thanked him, an absurd gesture given that he had never asked for this existence, and pressed her palm against the glass in a gesture that mimicked his frozen hand on the other side. The sounds of battle echoed through the stone corridors. Explosions muffled by distance and thick walls, but still powerful enough to shake dust from the ancient ceiling. Screams, human and otherwise, carried on the wind. The clash of metal, the roar of flames, the organized chaos of urban warfare filtered into the Hall of Ancestors where the dead lay in silent judgment of the living. Zoella drew her sword, a beautiful weapon of folded steel that had been in her family for 12 generations, and moved to the entrance of the hall to make her stand. The doors burst inward with a crash that cracked the stone frame. Prosper entered at the head of his personal guard, a dozen men who had abandoned the traditional weapons of their people in favor of the firearms that had given them victory after victory. The warlord himself was an imposing figure, tall and broad-shouldered, his blue skin marked with ritual scars that proclaimed his warrior status. He carried an ornate rifle, its stock inlaid with silver, its barrel inscribed with words in the old language that promised death to tyrants. Behind him they dragged Sofiani, the queen's silver robes torn and bloodied, her face bruised but her eyes defiant. Several members of the royal court were forced along as well, including the elderly healers who had kept Willi alive all these years. Prosper laughed, a sound like grinding stone, as he surveyed the Hall of Ancestors. He spoke of justice, of ending the corrupt dynasty, of executing the symbols of oppression here among the honored dead to make a point that would echo through history. Zoella stood alone before them, sword raised, positioned to defend the alcoves where the true ancestors rested. She knew she couldn't win, couldn't stop a dozen men armed with firearms, but surrender was not in her vocabulary. She would die here, and that was acceptable, as long as she took as many of them with her as possible. Prosper seemed to find this amusing. He raised his rifle, aiming not at Zoella, but at one of the coffins behind her, a calculated insult to strike at what she protected rather than at her directly. He fired. The report was deafening in the enclosed space, echoing off stone and glass with a sound like thunder contained. The bullet struck Willi's bioglass coffin with the sound of a bell being struck by a hammer. Cracks spiderwebbed across the surface, and the blue liquid began to leak, a thin stream at first and then a gushing flood as the structural integrity failed. The preservation field that had sustained Willi's stasis collapsed, its generators severed by the bullet that had punched through the glass and lodged itself in the stone wall beyond. For 30 years, Willi had been frozen. In an instant, he was not. The metabolic processes that had been held in suspension came roaring back to life with the violence of a dam breaking. His heart, which had been beating once every few minutes, suddenly accelerated to a frantic rhythm. His lungs, filled with preservation fluid, convulsed as his body tried to expel the foreign substance. Every nerve ending, dormant for 3 decades, fired simultaneously, sending conflicting signals of pain and sensation that overwhelmed his nervous system. He fell from the shattered coffin, hitting the stone floor hard enough to crack ribs that had not truly supported weight in 30 years. Blue fluid gushed from his mouth and nose as he vomited up what felt like gallons of the stuff, each heave sending fresh spikes of agony through his chest. His muscles spasmed, cramping viciously as they tried to remember how to function. His vision swam, colors too bright, shapes refusing to resolve into anything coherent. He tried to breathe and got only fire, tried to scream and produced only a wet gurgling sound. Through the haze of pain, he heard laughter. Prosper was laughing at him, calling him the dead god, the false savior who had slept through the age while real men fought for the future. The warlord approached, rifle still smoking, and aimed it down at Willi's convulsing form with the intention of finishing what the coffin's destruction had started. His finger tightened on the trigger, and Willi, still choking on preservation fluid, could do nothing but watch death approach for the second time in his cursed life. Metal rang against metal. Zoella's sword struck the rifle barrel just as it fired, deflecting the shot into the floor inches from Willi's head. Stone chips exploded, peppering his face with fragments. The warrior captain moved with the speed and precision of someone who had trained for this moment their entire life, her blade a silver blur as she engaged Prosper directly. The warlord was no slouch with close combat, dropping the rifle to draw a broad-bladed sword of his own, and they clashed in a duel that sent sparks flying with each impact. Prosper's guards moved to intervene, but Sofiani, seeing her chance, drove her elbow into the stomach of the man holding her and broke free. She lunged for one of the dropped rifles, and though she had never fired such a weapon before, desperation and royal training made her a quick study. She fired wildly, the recoil nearly knocking her down, but the shot caught one of the guards in the shoulder and sent him spinning away. The hall erupted into chaos, hostages fighting back, guards trying to restore order, the sharp crack of firearms mixing with the clash of steel on steel. Willi, still struggling to breathe, to see, to make his body obey basic commands after 3 decades of disuse, became aware of the hall's architecture in a way that the defenders had not. The years of staring at the ceiling had given him intimate knowledge of every beam, every joint, every structural weakness. He saw what they could not. The bombardment had damaged the keystone arch above the main entrance, the one through which Prosper's forces had flooded. The heavy ceremonial braziers that hung from chains attached to that arch were now supported by connections that had cracked and weakened. His voice, when he finally managed to force sound through his tortured throat, came out as a rasp barely louder than a whisper. But Zoella, engaged in her duel just meters away, had spent 30 years listening to his breathing, and she heard him. She heard him croak out 2 words in her language, words he had learned through years of eavesdropping on one-sided conversations: arch and chains. Their eyes met for the first time without glass between them. Hers were the same fierce amber he remembered from his first glimpse 30 years ago, now set in a face marked by age and experience, but still unmistakably hers. In that instant of connection, she understood. She broke off her engagement with Prosper, dodging his counterstroke with a roll that brought her to where her guard archers had fallen. She grabbed a bow from a dead man's hands, knocked an arrow with practiced ease, and aimed not at the enemy, but at the ceiling. She barked an order to the remaining loyal soldiers, and those who still had bows followed her lead. A volley of arrows flew upward, not a random discharge, but a precisely aimed strike at the chain links holding the massive braziers. Iron rang against iron, and the first chain snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The brazier, a cast iron construction that weighed several hundred pounds, swung down on its remaining chain, its momentum carrying it in a deadly arc. Prosper realized the danger too late. He tried to shout a warning, to get his men to retreat, but the hall's acoustics worked against him, his voice lost in the chaos of close combat. The second chain snapped, and the brazier fell, crashing into the weakened archway with the force of a siege weapon. Stone cracked, the sound like breaking bones, And then the entire arch collapsed. Tons of dressed stone, carefully fitted blocks that had stood for centuries, came down in a roaring avalanche that buried the entrance and half the hall beyond it. The majority of Prosper's force had been near that entrance, either securing their retreat route or pushing forward to join the melee. They disappeared under the stone in seconds, their screams cut short by crushing weight. Dust billowed through the hall, thick enough to choke on, reducing visibility to arm's length. When it finally settled, the defenders found themselves facing only a handful of enemies, including Prosper himself, who stood shocked and suddenly isolated among the rubble of his tactical advantage. The battle, which had seemed lost moments before, was now decidedly in favor of the defenders. The remaining rebels, seeing their leader's exposed position and their escape route buried, began to waver. Some dropped their weapons. Others tried to fight their way to alternate exits and were cut down by royal guards who were no longer outnumbered. Prosper himself, still formidable despite being alone, backed toward Willi's position, perhaps thinking to take a hostage or simply fighting to the last. Zoella intercepted him, and their duel resumed with renewed intensity. She was older now than she had been at her prime, the silver in her hair testament to years of service, but age had brought wisdom and economy of movement. She didn't waste energy on flashy techniques or unnecessary flourishes. Every strike was calculated, every parry minimal but sufficient. Prosper was bigger and stronger, but Zoella was faster and smarter, and she had 30 years of accumulated frustration to channel into each blow. The duel ranged across the hall, boots slipping in spilled preservation fluid, blades ringing against stone when strikes were dodged. Prosper landed a hit, his sword cutting through Zoella's armor to leave a red line across her ribs, but she gave back worse, her blade opening a gash across his forearm that made his grip falter. They circled each other, breathing hard, each looking for the opening that would end the fight. Willi, meanwhile, had managed to get his hands and knees under him, though the effort left him shaking and nauseous. The preservation fluid had done its job too well. His muscles had atrophied despite the stasis, and his nervous system was still relearning how to coordinate basic movements. He crawled toward the wall, toward where weapons had fallen during the initial chaos, driven by an instinct that he was not yet safe, that he needed to be able to defend himself. His hand closed on a crossbow, one of the same weapons that had put him in this situation 30 years ago. The irony was not lost on him. He tried to cock it, but his weakened arms couldn't draw the string back. He settled instead for a short spear, its shaft worn smooth by years of use, its tip crusted with dried blood from earlier fighting. Using it as a crutch, he levered himself to his feet, swaying like a drunk, every muscle screaming protest. Across the hall, Sofiani had rallied the surviving courtiers and guards, organizing them into a defensive position around the wounded and unarmed. She had a cut above her eye that bled freely, painting one side of her face red, and her silver robes were barely recognizable under the dirt and blood that stained them. But she stood tall, rifle in hand, covering her people with the authority of someone born to rule. When she saw Willi standing, leaning heavily on the spear but standing nonetheless, her eyes widened with something that might have been recognition or might have been shock. The tide had turned completely now. Prosper's remaining followers were being disarmed and secured, bound with cord from torn banners and watched by armed guards who showed no mercy to those who had invaded their most sacred space. The warlord himself fought on, but he was tiring, his movements becoming sluggish, his defenses less certain. Zoella pressed her advantage, driving him back toward the rubble-choked entrance where dust still hung in the air like fog. And then Prosper did what desperate men do when they know they're beaten. He went for the innocent. He feinted at Zoella, causing her to commit to a parry, then reversed direction and sprinted toward the group of courtiers. His target was obvious. Kill the queen, turn this defeat into a Pyrrhic victory, become a martyr who accomplished his mission even in death. His sword came up, and Sofiani, fumbling with the unfamiliar rifle, was too slow to bring it to bear. Willi didn't think. 30 years of paralysis, 30 years of watching and listening and being unable to act, had not dulled the reflexes that had made him throw himself into danger the first time. His body, still remembering training from his youth when he had been an athlete before becoming a scientist, moved on autopilot. He lurched forward, the spear dropping from his grasp as he converted his momentum into a tackle that would have made his old football coach proud. He hit Prosper at knee level, his shoulder driving into the warlord's legs with enough force to alter his trajectory. They went down together, crashing into a heap of tangled limbs and desperate grasping. Prosper was stronger, much stronger, and he recovered first, rolling atop Willi and slamming his fist down into Willi's face. Bone crunched, blood exploded from Willi's nose, and the world turned white with pain. A second punch, this one to the ribs, and Willi felt something crack inside his chest. A third, and he was coughing blood, his lungs punctured by broken ribs. But those few seconds of grappling had given Zoella time to close the distance. Her sword took Prosper through the shoulder, a precise strike that severed tendons and rendered his sword arm useless. The warlord screamed, more rage than pain, and tried to reach for a knife at his belt with his offhand. Zoella kicked the blade away, then placed the tip of her sword against his throat, pressing just hard enough to draw a bead of blue blood. The hall went silent. Everyone still standing watched the tableau. The legendary captain of the guard standing over her greatest enemy, blade poised to deliver the killing stroke, while Willi lay bleeding on the floor beside them, each breath a bubbling agony. Zoella's face was carved from stone, no mercy visible in her amber eyes, no hesitation in her grip. She had earned this kill through years of warfare, through soldiers lost under her command, through the burden of defending a realm against this man's aggression. Willi managed to force words through his broken mouth, words thick with blood and pain but still coherent. "Don't," he wheezed, each syllable costing him dearly. "Don't make him a martyr. Let the law judge him. Don't stain your honor with revenge." Zoella looked down at him, this human who had just taken a savage beating to save her queen, who had sacrificed 30 years of his life on an alien world for people not his own, who even now thought of justice rather than retribution. Something in her face softened, the killing fury banking down to a controlled burn. She nodded once, sharply, then reversed her sword and slammed the pommel into Prosper's temple, rendering him unconscious. Guards rushed forward to secure him, binding him with chains that would hold even his considerable strength. The aftermath of battle settled over the hall like the dust that still hung in the air. Healers moved among the wounded, performing triage, prioritizing those who could be saved over those too far gone. Bodies were being carried out, friend and foe alike, to be prepared according to their respective customs. Sofiani, still shaking from adrenaline but maintaining her royal composure, began issuing orders for securing the palace and accounting for all members of the court. Willi lay where he had fallen, unable to move even if he wanted to. The pain had become a distant thing, shock setting in as his body struggled to process the trauma of awakening, fighting, and being beaten half to death in the span of minutes. He stared up at the ceiling he knew so well, at the cracks he had memorized over 30 years, and found himself thinking it would be bitterly ironic if he died now, after surviving the impossible. Footsteps approached, and then Zoella was kneeling beside him, her armor scraped and dented, but her hands surprisingly gentle as they checked him for injuries. She spoke to him in her language, words he didn't need to understand to know were concerned, then switched to the trade language. "You idiot," she said, but there was no heat in it, only exhaustion and something that might have been affection. 30 years asleep, and the first thing you do is nearly get yourself killed again. He tried to smile, felt his split lip crack further, tasted more blood. Seemed like the thing to do, he managed. Besides, already saved. The princess once, queen now, needed saving too. Sofiani appeared at Zoella's shoulder, her young face solemn despite or perhaps because of the blood that covered it. She looked down at Willi for a long moment, then gracefully lowered herself to kneel on the stone floor, heedless of the mess that would make of her already ruined robes. "You saved me twice," she said in heavily accented but comprehensible trade language, "once from arrows and now from the one who ordered them loosed. I am Queen Sofiani, and I owe you a debt that can never be repaid." Behind her, the surviving members of the court and the royal guard were following her example, kneeling in a spreading wave of respect that flowed through the hall. Even the healers paused in their work to bow their heads. This was unprecedented, A queen kneeling to anyone not of her bloodline. But no one questioned it. Willi, the sleeping guardian, the twice savior, had earned honor beyond custom. "Please don't," Willi whispered, embarrassed despite his pain. "Just doing what anyone would?" "No," Zoella cut him off, her hand finding his and squeezing gently. "Not anyone. Not even me when it counted. You twice showed us what courage truly means. And both times you paid a terrible price. You are owed honor, and honor you shall have, whether you think you deserve it or not." The world was starting to gray again at the edges, shock and blood loss taking their toll. Willi's eyes started to close, his body shutting down to conserve resources for healing. The last thing he saw before consciousness fled was Zoella's face hovering over his, no longer the stern warrior, but simply a woman whose eyes held concern and something deeper. The last thing he felt was her hand holding his, anchoring him to the waking world even as sleep pulled him down. He woke 3 days later in what his confused mind initially took for a medical facility on an Earth station before memory reasserted itself. The room was bright with sunlight filtered through gauze curtains that billowed in a breeze smelling of flowers he had no name for. He lay in an actual bed, soft and comfortable, with bandages wrapping his torso and his broken nose splinted with some kind of lightweight material. Medical instruments that looked like they belonged in a museum sat on a nearby table alongside what were clearly more advanced analogs made of glass and polished metal. Zoella sat in a chair beside the bed, her head pillowed on her arms on the mattress edge, asleep. She had changed out of her armor into simple civilian clothing, her hair loose around her shoulders for the first time he had ever seen. In sleep, the harsh lines of command smoothed from her face, and he could see traces of the young woman she must have been before war and duty hardened her. Her hands still held his, fingers intertwined as if she was afraid he might disappear if she let go. When he shifted, trying to get more comfortable, she woke instantly, years of military alertness, making the transition from sleep to wakefulness instantaneous. Her eyes found his, and relief so profound, it was almost painful flashed across her features. "You're awake," she said unnecessarily, but with such heartfelt gladness that Willi felt warmth spread through his chest despite the ache of broken ribs. "The healers said you would wake, but I worried anyway," Willi finished when she trailed off. His voice was rough, but at least he could speak without choking on blood. "How long?" 3 days since the battle. Prosper is in chains awaiting trial. The siege is broken, his forces scattered when news of his capture spread. The city is damaged but standing, and Sofiani has proven herself a worthy queen in crisis. Zoella rattled off the information with military precision, then stopped, taking a breath. "And you have been floating between life and death, while healers argue about how to treat a human body they barely understand. But alive," and Willi pointed out, "again, seems to be a habit." "A terrible habit," Zoella said, but she was smiling, a real smile that transformed her face into something beautiful. "One we need to break you of. Twice is coincidence, but if you make it 3 times, we'll have to assume you're actively seeking ways to nearly die." They talked for hours, Zoella filling him in on everything that had happened while he slept. The repairs to the hall, the state funeral for those who had died in the battle, the political maneuvering as the queen consolidated power in the wake of Prosper's failed coup. She told him about the reaction when he had stood, when word spread that the sleeping guardian had awakened after 30 years, about the songs already being composed and the legends already growing around his actions. But more importantly, they talked about the 30 years between them. Willi asked her to tell him what happened, to fill in the gaps in his knowledge beyond what he had overheard. Zoella spoke of campaigns and battles, of cities besieged and defended, of political alliances forged and broken. She spoke of watching Sofiani grow from a traumatized child into a woman capable of ruling, of the pride she felt mixed with the terror of knowing how easily it could all have been lost. And she spoke of the evenings she had spent in the hall, talking to his coffin, confessing things she had told no one else. She admitted that she had fallen in love with him somewhere in those 30 years, with the idea of him, if not the reality, with the man who had given everything for a child not his own. It was a ridiculous love, she acknowledged. Loving someone who couldn't respond, who might never wake, But the heart did not always follow logic. Willi listened, and when she finished, he told her about Emily. Not just the bare facts she had gleaned from the audio recordings, but the whole story. A marriage that had ended in quiet mutual agreement when his work took him further from Earth and his wife's career kept her grounded. A daughter caught between them and trying to love both. The guilt of missing moments, of being absent more than present, of the last conversation where Emily had asked when he was coming home and he hadn't had an answer. The shattering news of the accident, the funeral he had watched via comlink because he was too far away to attend. The grief that had driven him to sign up for the Kepler expedition where he could lose himself in work and distance. When I saw Sofiani in danger, he said quietly, I saw Emily. I saw the chance to save what I couldn't save before. It was selfish in a way. I wasn't thinking about your princess. I was thinking about my daughter. Does it matter? Zoella asked. The result was the same. Sofiani lived because you acted, whatever your reasons. And She paused, searching for words. I found something I didn't know I needed. Someone who knew all of me, the ugly parts I hide from everyone else, and didn't judge. Even if you couldn't speak, you listened. You were there. You were real. Over the following weeks, Willi's recovery progressed with frustrating slowness. His body, preserved for 30 years, had been suddenly thrust back into normal metabolic function and then immediately traumatized. Muscles had to be retrained, bones had to heal, neurological pathways had to be rebuilt. The healers combined their traditional knowledge with information extracted from his shuttle's medical database, creating hybrid treatments that were part ancient herbal remedy and part modern pharmacology. The first time Willi tried to stand unaided, his legs gave out completely and he crashed to the floor, taking a table of medical instruments down with him. The clatter brought 3 healers running, but Zoella was already there, kneeling beside him as he lay tangled in the wreckage. He expected her to be frustrated, to see disappointment in her eyes at his weakness. Instead, she was laughing, a genuine sound he had never heard before during all those years of one-sided conversation. What's funny? He managed, embarrassed and aching. You survived 30 years in a glass coffin, woke up to save a kingdom, got beaten half to death by a warlord, and you're defeated by standing up, she said, helping him sit upright. The universe has a terrible sense of humor. He started laughing too, and then they were both laughing like fools while the healers tried to maintain professional dignity and failed utterly. It became a running joke between them, this moment of absolute absurdity that somehow broke the last remaining ice between 2 people who had known each other for decades without ever truly meeting. Zoella was there through all of it, taking a leave of absence from her command duties to focus on his rehabilitation. She helped him with physical therapy, supporting his weight as he relearned to walk, encouraging him through the pain of stretched muscles and complaining joints. The sessions were brutal, pushing him to limits he didn't think he could reach, but she was merciless in the way only someone who truly cared could be. She knew the difference between pain that meant damage and pain that meant progress, and she pushed him through the latter without hesitation. The day Willi finally managed to walk without assistance for more than a few minutes, Zoella surprised him by suggesting they leave the medical wing. You need to see what you saved, she said, offering him her arm not for support but for companionship. The city, the people. 30 years have changed things. They walked slowly through the palace corridors, Willi marveling at how different everything looked from his fragmented memories of being carried here dying. The stone walls he remembered as ancient and worn had been reinforced in places, new construction seamlessly blended with old. Battle damage from the siege was still visible, scorch marks on walls, hastily patched sections where cannon fire had torn through centuries-old masonry. Workers were everywhere, rebuilding, restoring, making the palace whole again. When they emerged into the main courtyard, Willi stopped, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of activity. The market district visible beyond the palace walls teemed with life. Blue-skinned merchants hawked their wares from stalls that stretched as far as he could see. Children, including some who were clearly too young to remember the war, played games in the streets under the watchful eyes of mothers and grandmothers. Soldiers patrolled in pairs, their weapons peace-bonded but ready, maintaining order without oppression. It's so different, Willi said, trying to reconcile the bustling city before him with the glimpses he had caught during his initial observations 30 years ago. The last time I saw this place, it was smaller, quieter. 30 years of growth, Zoella explained. After the territorial wars ended, people came to the capital seeking opportunity. The population has nearly doubled. We had to expand the walls twice. She pointed to distant fortifications that looked newer, less weathered than the inner defenses. Those went up 15 years ago, after a border dispute with the eastern provinces. They walked through the market, and Willi noticed something that made his heart ache. People recognized Zoella, of course, they always did, but they also looked at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Curiosity, respect, something that might have been awe. A merchant selling what looked like fruit stopped them, pressing a wrapped bundle into Zoella's hands and refusing payment. "For the sleeping guardian," the merchant said in heavily accented trade language, addressing Willi directly. "My grandmother told me stories. How you saved the little princess. How you slept while the kingdom fought. How you woke to save us again. This is not enough thanks, but it is what I have." Willi tried to refuse, uncomfortable with the reverence, but Zoella accepted gracefully and pulled him along. "You're a legend," she said, amused by his discomfort. "Songs have been written. Children play games where one of them gets to be the sleeping guardian who jumps out at the last moment. You're part of their mythology now." "I just did what anyone would do," Willi protested, the same refrain he had given before. "No," Zoella said firmly. "You did what no one else did. That's the difference between ordinary and legendary." Later that week, Zoella took him back to the Hall of Ancestors. Willi hadn't been there since he had awakened in chaos and violence, and approaching it now in peace felt surreal. The entrance had been completely rebuilt, the collapsed archway now supported by newer stone that didn't quite match the ancient blocks around it. Inside, the hall was quieter, more serene, the chaos of battle replaced by the contemplative silence of a sacred place. His alcove was empty. The bioglass coffin was gone, destroyed beyond repair, and in its place stood a different kind of monument. A stone statue carved with impressive skill showed a man in mid-leap, arms outstretched, body positioned protectively over a smaller figure. The detail was remarkable. They had captured the determination in the face, the acceptance of sacrifice, the moment of choice frozen in stone forever. "The Queen commissioned it," Zoella said softly, standing beside him as he stared at his own idealized image. "She wanted future generations to understand what you did. Not just the first time, but both times. The man who couldn't stand by while a child was in danger." Willi reached out, touching the cold stone, feeling the craftsmanship under his fingers. Around the base, inscriptions in multiple languages told the story. The date of his sacrifice, the 30 years of stasis, his second intervention that saved the kingdom. It was strange seeing his life reduced to words carved in stone, his choices immortalized for strangers to contemplate. "Do you regret it?" Zoella asked, watching his face carefully. "Knowing what it cost you?" Willi thought about the question seriously. 30 years gone, his body damaged, his future uncertain, everything he had known erased by the passage of time. Against that, he weighed what he had gained. This woman beside him, the chance to make a difference, the knowledge that his sacrifice had meaning. "No," he said finally, "I don't regret it. I just wish I'd been awake for more of it." They stood together in silence, two people connected by 30 years of one-sided conversation and a shared moment of violence, both understanding that some bonds couldn't be explained in words. The Hall of Ancestors held the remembered dead, but Willi had returned from that twilight state, and in doing so, had become something more than the legend they carved in stone. One afternoon, during a particularly difficult session where Willi was trying to climb stairs for the first time, his frustration boiled over. "I can't do this," he gasped halfway up the flight, his legs shaking with effort. "It's too much, too fast." Zoella, positioned behind him to catch him if he fell, said quietly, "I watched you lie in that coffin for 30 years. I watched you not give up, not surrender, not let the darkness take you even when it would have been easier. You survived what should have killed you. You can climb these stairs." He made it to the top, collapsed at the landing, and found her sitting beside him, both of them breathing hard as if they had run a marathon. "How did you know I didn't give up in there?" he asked. "How could you tell?" "Your eyes," she said simply. "Even through the glass, even frozen as you were, your eyes never looked empty, never looked like you had surrendered. I've seen dead men's eyes, Willi. Yours were alive, trapped but fighting. Every day I came, I looked for that spark, and every day it was still there." They talked constantly, making up for 30 years of one-sided conversation with a dialogue that ranged from philosophy to gossip, from tactical discussions to terrible jokes. Willi learned that Zoella had a wicked sense of humor hidden beneath her stern exterior, that she could do devastating impressions of pompous nobles, that she had once gotten drunk at a military banquet and challenged 3 generals to arm wrestling contests that she won handily. She learned that he was terrible at remembering names but could recite complex geological formations from memory, that he sang badly but enthusiastically in the bath, that he had once accidentally started a small fire in his earth apartment, trying to cook dinner, and had lived on ration bars for a month afterward. The city around them slowly returned to normalcy. Damage from the siege was repaired, walls rebuilt, the market districts reopening as merchants returned to business. Prosper was tried in a public forum that lasted 3 days, found guilty of treason and murder, and sentenced to life imprisonment in the deepest cells beneath the palace. He had demanded death, wanting martyrdom, but Sofiani wisely denied him that, letting him live out his days forgotten and impotent. Sofiani herself visited Willi regularly, bringing gifts and stories of statecraft. She was 29 now, he learned, though she looked younger to his human eyes. She had never married, dedicating herself to rulership with a focus that reminded Willi of Zoella. She spoke of her kidnapping as a formative moment, one that had taught her that duty sometimes meant accepting help, that pride could get people killed, and that true strength lay in knowing when to rely on others. "You taught me that," she said during one visit, "even though you were asleep. Zoella told me how you sacrificed yourself without hesitation, without considering the cost. That's what I try to be for my people, someone who will pay any price for their safety." "Just don't be too quick to die for them," Willi cautioned. "Dead rulers can't help anyone. Better to live and serve than die and be remembered." As months passed, the relationship between Willi and Zoella deepened into something neither had expected but both needed. They were from different worlds, literally different species, different contexts entirely. She was a soldier who had spent her life in service to a crown. He was a scientist who had abandoned his calling to wallow in grief. By any logical measure, they should not work, but logic had little to do with it. They had shared intimacy of a strange kind, the intimacy of being fully known. She had confessed her deepest fears to him, thinking he would never judge because he would never wake. He had heard her at her most vulnerable, seen past the armor, both literal and metaphorical, understood the woman beneath the legend. When he finally woke, that foundation was already there, 3 decades deep and solid as stone. She took him to the gardens one evening, walking slowly to accommodate his still recovering body. The alien plants glowed softly in the twilight, bioluminescent flowers opening to the night air, with a scent like honey and ozone. They sat on a bench carved from a single piece of stone, watching small flying creatures that looked like crosses between birds and bats, dancing in the air above a fountain. "I should go home," Willi said quietly. "Earth, report what happened. Face whatever consequences there are for breaking non-interference protocols." Zoella's hand tightened on his. "Should you?" "I don't know anymore," he admitted. Earth was home. Emily was home. But Emily is gone, and Earth feels like a memory from someone else's life. I woke up here in this time, and everything I knew is 30 years past. My colleagues are retired or dead. The research station has probably moved on to a different planet. I'm a ghost from a previous era. "Then stay," Zoella said, turning to face him fully. "Not as a ghost, as a living man. Here, with me." It wasn't a question, but an offer, one that hung in the air between them with the weight of everything unspoken. Willi looked at her, this warrior woman who had hated him, respected him, loved him, and waited for him through 3 decades of one-sided conversation. He thought of Emily, of the guilt he had carried, of the sacrifice that had led him here. And he thought of the future, a future he hadn't expected to have, stretching forward into unknown territory. "I'll stay," he said and kissed her, tasting salt from tears he wasn't sure were his or hers. The decision made, life settled into a pattern that felt almost domestic. Willi moved into Zoella's quarters in the military complex, a functional space that she gradually made more livable with his help. They learned each other's rhythms, the small adjustments that living together required. She woke before dawn every day, a habit ingrained by decades of military routine, while he was more of a night person, often staying up late reading by lamplight. She was meticulous about cleaning weapons and maintaining gear. He left his notes scattered everywhere, an organizational system that made sense only to him. They fought occasionally, sharp arguments about nothing and everything, but they learned to fight fair, to apologize when wrong, to compromise when needed. Willi studied her language seriously now, going beyond the passive understanding he had gained through years of eavesdropping to active fluency. Zoella learned about Earth, about human history and culture, about the world that had shaped the man she loved. She found the differences fascinating and the similarities comforting. A year after his awakening, something impossible happened. Zoella began showing signs of pregnancy. The healers were baffled, then excited, then concerned as they realized they were dealing with something unprecedented. Interspecies reproduction between sapient races was theoretically possible, but had never been documented, and human blue skin alien hybrids fell well outside their medical knowledge. Willi spent hours with the healers, explaining human pregnancy and development as best he could remember from basic biology courses decades past. They combined their knowledge, creating a monitoring protocol that drew from both their traditions. The pregnancy progressed normally by both species standards, which was simultaneously reassuring and terrifying. Zoella was 42, old for a first pregnancy by any measure, but her warrior's body adapted with the same determination she brought to everything. They argued about names, about traditions, about whether the child should be raised with more emphasis on mother's culture or father's, ultimately deciding on both. They prepared a room, combining human sensibilities about color and comfort with the structural aesthetics common to this world. Zoella continued working until late in her pregnancy, refusing to be sidelined, while Willi fretted and generally made a nuisance of himself with his concern. The birth was difficult but not dangerous, and the healers proved adept at adapting their techniques to the hybrid nature of their patient. When they finally placed the baby in Zoella's arms, Willi felt his heart stop and restart at the sight. A girl, healthy and crying with the outrage of the newly born, with skin the same sky blue as her mother's, but with Willi's bone structure, his eyes, his hands. They named her Pauline, combining syllables from both their languages into something new, something that belonged fully to neither world but to both. Willi held his daughter and cried, finally grieving properly for Emily while simultaneously celebrating Pauline. They were not the same, could never be the same, and that was okay. He had not replaced his lost child, but had been given the undeserved gift of a second chance at fatherhood. Zoella watched him with understanding, having listened to enough of his confessions about Emily to know what this moment meant, and simply held them both while he wept. Life with a baby was simultaneously exhausting and exhilarating. Pauline proved to be a healthy, curious child who demanded constant attention and gave back unbridled affection. She was a bridge between species, a living proof that maybe the barriers everyone assumed were impermeable could actually be crossed. Scientists wanted to study her, which Willi and Zoella firmly rejected. Diplomats wanted to use her as a symbol of cooperation, which they also refused. She was their daughter, not a political prop or a laboratory specimen, and she would be raised as normally as possible given the extraordinary circumstances of her existence. When Pauline was 2 years old, the relative peace they had found was shattered. Fanatics who had followed Prosper's ideology, who believed in racial purity and the supremacy of their kind, had not given up despite their leader's imprisonment. They saw Pauline as an abomination, a crime against nature, and they came for her with the zealotry of true believers. The attack came at night, a coordinated strike on their home by a dozen armed men who had somehow gotten past the military complex's security. Willi woke to the sound of breaking glass and reached automatically for the weapon he now kept by the bed. Zoella was already up, moving with the silent efficiency of a lifetime soldier, placing herself between the door and Pauline's room. They fought together for the first time as partners rather than strangers united by circumstance. Willi had been training, learning the basics of combat from the woman who was arguably the best warrior in the kingdom. And while he would never match her skill, he was competent enough to be useful. He used the spear Zoella had given him, a weapon suited to someone with reach and basic technique, while she wielded dual blades with a ferocity that left bodies in her wake. The attackers had expected to find a scientist and a retired soldier caught off guard. Instead, they found two desperate parents defending their child, which was an entirely different and more dangerous situation. Willi took wounds, a knife slash across his ribs and a club blow to his shoulder that left that arm numb, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop, not with Pauline's cries coming from the room behind them. Zoella fought like a force of nature, her blades painting arcs of blood in the air, her movements economical and lethal. When reinforcements finally arrived, drawn by the sounds of combat, they found 5 attackers dead, 3 unconscious, and 4 fled. Willi was sitting against the wall, holding Pauline and bleeding from multiple wounds while Zoella stood guard over them both, still ready to fight despite her own injuries. The message was clear. They had tried to take the child, and they had failed utterly. The surviving attackers were captured, interrogated, and traced back to a cell of extremists operating from the southern territories. The incident forced a reckoning. Sofiani, furious that someone had dared attack members of her court, launched a widespread crackdown on remaining rebel sympathizers. But more importantly, it made Willi and Zoella realize that their daughter would never be truly safe in the capital, where politics and prejudice could turn deadly. They needed somewhere remote, somewhere defensible, somewhere they could raise Pauline away from the pressures and dangers of court life. Sofiani offered them an estate in the mountain foothills, 3 days' travel from the capital by the fastest conveyance. It was a fortified manor that had belonged to a noble family before the wars, now maintained by the crown but rarely used. Remote enough for privacy, secure enough for safety, beautiful enough for a life. They accepted gratefully, and within a month they had relocated, leaving behind the politics and proximity to power for something simpler. The mountain estate became their haven. Willi set up a laboratory of sorts, combining human technology salvaged from his shuttle with local materials to create hybrid instruments. He studied the local geology, the ecology, mapping the systems and relationships with the joy of a scientist, finally able to pursue curiosity without restriction. He taught Pauline about the stars, about Earth and the other worlds humans had reached, about the scientific method and the importance of observation. The mountains themselves proved to be a constant source of discovery and occasional danger. The blue-furred predators that Willi had once observed from a distance now roamed close to their estate, drawn by the presence of livestock kept by the caretakers. One morning, when Pauline was 7, she wandered too far from the main house, chasing what she thought was a harmless 6-legged herbivore into a rocky outcrop. Willi found her cornered by a pack of 3 hunters, their blue fur bristling, their teeth bared in warning. The girl stood her ground, holding a stick she had picked up, trying to remember her mother's lessons about never showing fear to predators. Willi approached slowly, making himself large, shouting to draw their attention. The pack leader turned toward him, assessing this new threat, trying to decide if the easier prey was worth fighting this larger opponent. Zoella arrived at a dead run, her sword already drawn, but Willi held up a hand to stop her. He had learned something about these creatures during his years of observation, a behavior pattern that most hunters overlooked. He dropped to one knee, making himself smaller, non-threatening, and began making a low clicking sound in his throat. The pack leader's ears swiveled forward, confusion replacing aggression. Willi clicked again, adding a hand gesture he had seen mothers of the species use with their young. The standoff lasted an eternity, compressed into seconds. Then the pack leader huffed, turned away, and led its companions back into the rocks. Pauline ran to her father, and Willi held her while his hands shook with delayed fear. Zoella sheathed her sword and joined them, and they sat there in the mountain grass while Willi explained what he had done, how observation and patience could sometimes succeed where violence would only guarantee bloodshed. "But what if they had attacked anyway?" Pauline asked, her child's voice still trembling. Then your mother would have cut them down before they took 3 steps, Willi said, looking at Zoella with absolute confidence. Sometimes knowledge works, and sometimes you need a sharp blade and someone skilled enough to use it. The wisdom is knowing which is which. Zoella maintained her warrior's discipline, training daily in the courtyard, keeping her skills sharp even in retirement. She taught Pauline about honor and duty, about protecting those weaker, about the responsibility that came with strength. She taught her daughter the fighting arts, starting with basic forms and gradually increasing complexity as Pauline grew. She told her stories of battles and heroes, of the war with Prosper, of the sleeping guardian who became her father. But she also taught her daughter to dance, a skill Willi hadn't known she possessed. On festival days when the household staff celebrated their traditional holidays, Zoella would dance the old warrior forms that were both combat practice and artistic expression. She moved with lethal grace, her body telling stories of ancient battles and fallen heroes, and Pauline watched with wide eyes trying to memorize every step. "Teach me," the girl demanded one evening, and Zoella smiled. "Your father should learn too," she said, pulling Willi to his feet despite his protests. "This is part of who we are, and you should know all of your heritage, both sides." So Willi, who had never been particularly coordinated, learned to dance the warrior forms alongside his daughter, stumbling and laughing at his own clumsiness, while Zoella corrected their postures with a patience she had never shown to actual soldiers. Those evenings became treasured memories, the 3 of them moving through the forms together in the courtyard while the sun set over the mountains and the world felt perfectly, impossibly right. The mountains were beautiful but unforgiving, and the family learned this truth when Pauline was 6 years old. It happened during the cold season, when storms swept down from the peaks and the blue-furred predators that normally avoided the lower elevations were driven by hunger into territories they wouldn't normally venture. Willi had been in his workshop, cataloging mineral samples, when he heard Pauline scream. He ran without thinking, grabbing the first weapon that came to hand, a hunting knife that Zoella had given him for his fieldwork. He burst into the courtyard to find his daughter backed against the wall, 3 massive creatures circling her. They looked like the wolf-sized predators he had observed 30 years ago, but starvation had made them desperate and bold. Their blue fur was matted and thin, ribs visible beneath their skin, and their eyes held the desperate gleam of animals with nothing left to lose. Willi shouted, trying to draw their attention away from Pauline. 2 of the creatures turned toward him, but the third lunged at the girl. Willi threw himself forward, the knife in his hand more talisman than weapon, knowing he was too slow, too far away. But Pauline had been learning from Zoella. The girl dropped and rolled, just as her mother had taught her, and the predator's jaws snapped on empty air where she had been. The other 2 creatures came at Willi from different angles, pack hunters working in coordination. He managed to slash one across the muzzle, drawing blue blood and a yelp of pain, but the second got its teeth into his leg. The pain was immediate and intense, but he had felt worse. He had felt poison spreading through his veins, had felt ribs breaking under a warlord's fists. This was just pain, and pain he could handle. He stabbed down, bearing the knife between the creature's shoulders. It released him and staggered away, whimpering, but the damage was done. Willi's leg wouldn't support his weight properly. He fell to one knee, trying to position himself between the remaining predators and Pauline, but they were regrouping, preparing for another coordinated strike. Then Zoella was there, moving like violence is given form. She had been in the training hall on the other side of the estate when she heard her daughter scream, and she had covered the distance in seconds that should have been impossible. Her sword sang as it cleared the scabbard, and the first creature didn't have time to react before she took its head off with a single stroke. The second tried to flee, but she ran it down, her blade finding its heart with surgical precision. The third creature, the one that had gone for Pauline, turned to face this new threat. It was bigger than the others, probably the pack leader, and even starving it was formidable. It circled Zoella, looking for an opening, while she matched its movements with predatory grace. When it finally committed to an attack, lunging low for her legs, she was ready. She vaulted over it, her sword descending as she passed overhead, opening the creature's spine from neck to tail. The courtyard fell silent except for Willi's ragged breathing and Pauline's quiet crying. Zoella cleaned her blade on the dead creature's fur, sheathed it, and then she was checking them both, hands gentle but thorough as she examined injuries. Willi's leg was badly torn, deep punctures that would need stitching. Pauline was unharmed physically but shaken, clinging to her mother with the desperation of a child who had just learned that the world could be deadly. "You did well," Zoella told her daughter, stroking her hair. "You remembered your training. You didn't freeze. I'm proud of you." "I was scared," Pauline admitted in a small voice. "Being scared is smart," Zoella said. "Brave people are scared. They just don't let the fear stop them from doing what needs to be done. Like your father here, who ran toward danger with nothing but a knife because you needed him." They carried Willi inside, and Zoella stitched his wounds with the same efficient care she brought to everything. The punctures were deep but clean, and her field medicine skills kept them from festering. As she worked, Pauline watched, learning, asking questions about wound care and infection, and how to tell if damage was serious or superficial. "This is part of mountain life," Zoella explained to them both. "The predators usually avoid us, but hunger makes any creature dangerous. We need to be more careful, more prepared. I should have had perimeter alarms set. I got complacent, thought we were safe here." "We are safe," Willi said through gritted teeth as she pulled another stitch tight. "Because you're here. Because you taught Pauline what to do. Because we worked together." After that incident, they made changes. Zoella set up a proper defensive perimeter, bells and tripwires that would warn of approaching animals. She intensified Pauline's training, teaching her not just forms but practical combat, how to defend herself against creatures that didn't follow rules of engagement. Willi crafted improvised weapons, using his knowledge of materials and physics to create spring-loaded traps and noisemakers that would frighten predators away from the estate. The attack had been frightening, but it had also taught them something important. They were capable. Together, they could face the dangers of this world and prevail. Pauline, in particular, seemed to grow from the experience, losing some of her childhood innocence, but gaining confidence in its place. She had faced death and survived, had seen her parents protect her, and learned to protect herself. It was a harsh lesson, but one that would serve her well in the years to come. They were happy. It was a simple statement, but profound for its truth. Willi, who had come to this world drowning in grief and guilt, found peace in the routine of family life. Zoella, who had dedicated her existence to duty and service, discovered the joy of living for herself and her family. Pauline grew up surrounded by love and knowledge, a child who belonged to two worlds and understood both. But nothing lasts forever, and the long-term effects of Willi's 30-year stasis eventually began to manifest. He was in his late 50s now by Earth reckoning, but his body was showing degradation beyond normal aging. The preservation had worked almost too well, keeping his cells in suspended animation, but the abrupt revival had damaged systems in ways that the healers had warned about but couldn't prevent. It started small, forgetting where he had put something, losing track of a conversation mid-sentence, calling Pauline by Emily's name, and then being confused when she didn't respond. The healers examined him and delivered the diagnosis they had feared: neurological degradation, a progressive condition where the neurons that had been frozen were now dying off faster than normal, causing memory loss, confusion, eventual cognitive collapse. It was irreversible. The only question was how fast it would progress. Willi took the news with the same calm he had brought to facing the poisoned arrows. He had been living on borrowed time for 30 years. If this was how his story ended, he could accept that. Zoella did not take it so well. She raged against the unfairness, demanded that the healers find a solution, threatened to tear apart libraries searching for some forgotten treatment that might help. But in the end, she accepted what could not be changed and focused on what she could do: make sure Willi's remaining time was as good as possible. They made a plan. On his clear days when his mind was working properly, Willi would record everything. Stories about Earth, about his life before the stasis, about Emily and the grief that had driven him to act. He spoke into a recording device, primitive by Earth standards but sufficient, creating an archive of his memories before they were lost. Zoella organized their life around supporting him, creating routines that were consistent and comforting, surrounding him with familiar objects and people. Pauline, 10 years old and precocious, understood more than they gave her credit for. She saw her father forgetting things, calling her by another name, sometimes looking at her with confusion as if trying to place who she was. It hurt, but she also remembered her mother's lessons about duty and sacrifice. Her father had given 30 years of his life for a stranger. The least she could do was be patient with him now. There were good days scattered through the decline, days when Willi woke up clear-headed and spent hours with Pauline, teaching her about spectroscopy or explaining plate tectonics. Days when he and Zoella could sit in the garden and talk like they used to, without him losing the thread or becoming confused about where he was. On one such evening, with the sun setting over the mountains and painting the sky in shades of purple and gold, Willi took Zoella's hand and said something she would remember for the rest of her life. "I would do it again," he said quietly. "Every second in the ice, every day of pain after, every moment of this disease eating my brain. I would do it all again, exactly the same, because it led me here, to you, to Pauline, to a life I never imagined I could have. If I could go back and choose differently, choose to let Sofiani die and avoid all of this, I wouldn't change a thing." Zoella couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She just held his hand and memorized his face, the lines around his eyes, the gray in his hair, the particular way the sunset light caught in his eyes. She knew these moments were numbered, that each clear conversation might be the last, and she hoarded them like a dragon hoards gold. The decline accelerated. By the time Pauline was 12, Willi had more bad days than good. He often thought he was back on Earth, working at the research facility, preparing for the expedition. He called for Emily, asked where his team was, demanded to see reports that didn't exist. Zoella learned to play along, to gently redirect rather than correct, to provide comfort even when he didn't recognize her. Pauline learned the same, becoming whoever he needed her to be in those moments of confusion. But even in his decline, flashes of the man he had been showed through. A moment of lucidity where he would recognize them and apologize for being difficult. An evening where he would tell a story perfectly, every detail correct, his narration as engaging as it had ever been. A morning where he would wake up and immediately ask what he had missed, what day it was, how long he had been confused. Those moments were precious and painful in equal measure. Willi died peacefully in his sleep, 13 years after Pauline's birth, 12 years after the diagnosis. Zoella had been holding his hand, something she did every night now, and she felt the moment his grip relaxed for the last time. His breathing had been shallow and irregular for hours, but the final stop was so gentle she almost missed it. She sat with him until dawn, unwilling to let go, memorizing the feel of his hand in hers, the cooling of his skin, the absolute stillness of death. They buried him with honors in the Hall of Ancestors, that place where his strange journey had begun. The alcove where his coffin had stood for 30 years was converted into a proper tomb, and they laid him there with ceremony and respect. Thousands attended, from Sofiani herself to common soldiers who had heard the stories, to civilians who saw him as a symbol of selfless sacrifice. Zoella stood dry-eyed through the ceremony, her warrior's discipline keeping her composed, but Pauline cried enough for both of them. The girl, now 13 and rapidly approaching adulthood by the standards of her mother's people, delivered the eulogy. She spoke clearly, with only a slight tremor betraying her grief, about the father who had taught her to see wonder in the world, who had shown her that courage was a choice made in the moment, not an inherent trait. She talked about his sacrifice, about the cost he had paid and continued paying, about the example he had set. "My father was not a warrior by training," Pauline said, her voice carrying through the hall that had witnessed so much of Willi's story. "He was a scientist who wanted to understand the world, but when the moment came, he acted with a warrior's heart, and he paid a warrior's price. He taught us that bravery is not about skill or strength. It's about seeing what needs to be done and doing it, regardless of cost. He did that twice in his life, and both times it cost him everything. We are here because he chose others over himself. That is the lesson he leaves us." Zoella lived long after Willi's death, taking on the role of elder stateswoman and advisor to the Queen. She never took another lover, never sought to replace what she had had. "Some loves were unique," she told Pauline when the girl asked, "and some bonds couldn't be replicated." She had loved once, deeply and truly, and that was enough for one lifetime. She focused on raising Pauline, who proved to be as remarkable as her parentage suggested. The girl inherited her mother's discipline and warrior instinct combined with her father's curiosity and analytical mind. She became a bridge builder, literally and figuratively, working to foster understanding between the conservative elements of her mother's people and the progressive factions that wanted more contact with the humans who were slowly establishing a more formal presence on the planet. Pauline studied both cultures, mastering her mother's language and her father's, learning the fighting arts and the sciences, becoming fluent in both worlds. She entered diplomatic service as soon as she was old enough, using her unique position to mediate disputes and forge connections. She argued passionately for cooperation, for exchange of knowledge and culture, for seeing differences as strengths rather than threats. Her work bore fruit slowly but surely. The isolated research stations became formal embassies. Trade agreements were negotiated. Cultural exchanges began, with scholars and artists visiting both worlds. Pauline was at the center of it all, the living proof that cooperation was possible, that the barriers between species were social constructs rather than biological necessities. Zoella watched her daughter's career with pride and a bittersweet ache, seeing so much of Willi in Pauline's approach to problems, in her stubborn optimism, in her belief that understanding could overcome prejudice. The girl had inherited the best of both parents, and she was using those gifts to reshape her world. When Zoella finally felt her strength beginning to fail, felt the years catching up to a body that had been pushed hard for decades, she requested one thing: to be buried next to Willi in the garden of their mountain estate. Not in the Hall of Ancestors where protocol dictated a warrior of her rank should rest, but in the simple peace of the place they had made their home. Sofiani granted the request without question, understanding that some bonds transcended tradition. They laid her to rest on a clear autumn morning, the mountains standing sentinel around them, the garden full of the flowers she had planted during her retirement. Pauline, now grown and accomplished, stood beside the grave and spoke not a formal eulogy, but simple words of farewell to the woman who had taught her strength and honor and love. The headstones, carved from local stone and polished smooth, bore inscriptions in both languages, human and native, ensuring that anyone who came here would understand the story. Willi's read, "He gave time so we could have a future." Zoella's read, "She gave her heart so he could have a home." Together, they summarized a story that had begun with poisoned arrows and a moment of instinctive sacrifice, that had grown through 30 years of one-sided conversation, that had bloomed into love and family, and that had ended with peace and legacy. Pauline maintained the estate as a memorial, visiting regularly even as her work took her across continents and eventually into the stars when humanity's presence expanded beyond simple research. She brought her own children there, grandchildren who carried genes from 3 worlds and who grew up with stories of the sleeping guardian and the warrior captain. She told them about sacrifice and duty, about love that crossed impossible boundaries, about the choices that defined us more than our circumstances. The story of Willi and Zoella became legend, told and retold with the kind of embellishment that stories accumulate over time. But at its core remained a simple truth. A man had seen a child in danger and had acted without thought for himself. That single moment had cost him 30 years of life and led to his eventual death. But it had also given him a family, a purpose, and a love he had never expected to find. It had changed the course of history for an entire world, had built bridges between species, had proven that sometimes the most important decisions are made in instinct rather than calculation. And in the mountain garden, where 2 graves rested side by side, where flowers bloomed in alien colors, and the wind sang through trees with blue-tinted bark, their story lived on, a testament to courage and sacrifice, and the unexpected paths that life can take when we choose others over ourselves.